Arrogant Judge Edward Chen insults Pam Bondi in court. Minutes later, he's dragged out in handcuffs. Stay to the end to discover the unbelievable twist that left the entire nation in shock. Like, subscribe, and tell us your thoughts on this jaw-dropping story of justice. It was one of those mornings in San Francisco where the air felt unusually tense, as if the city itself knew something significant was about to unfold. Outside the towering U.S. District Court building on Golden Gate Avenue, a crowd had started to gather earlier than usual. Reporters with cameras and microphones huddled around the marble steps. Legal clerks shuffled in briskly, and several curious onlookers had stationed themselves across the street with coffee cups in hand. The case on today's docket wasn't your average trial. It was a high-profile hearing involving corporate fraud and public corruption. The stakes were enormous, and so was the list of key figures involved. Among them was Pam Bondi, the former Attorney General of Florida, and now a powerhouse private attorney known for her unflinching integrity and razor-sharp courtroom presence. She had flown in specifically for this case, representing a group of whistleblowers who had risked their careers and lives to expose a billion-dollar cover-up involving a powerful Silicon Valley conglomerate. The company, Avalon Dynamics, had been funneling illegal donations to political campaigns and manipulating federal contracts, a scheme that reached deep into both corporate and political spheres. Presiding over the hearing was Judge Edward Chen, an experienced federal judge with decades on the bench, but a man whose reputation was complicated. Known for his authoritarian courtroom demeanor, Chen had developed a reputation behind closed doors for being dismissive, arrogant, and at times outright condescending, especially toward attorneys he didn't personally approve of. And today, for reasons only he fully understood, Pam Bondi was squarely in his sights. The hearing room was packed, every seat was filled, and extra chairs had been brought in along the back walls. Journalists perched over their notepads, and camera crews prepared to report on every second of what promised to be a blockbuster day. Pam entered the courtroom with her usual confident stride, dressed in a simple but elegant navy blue suit. She greeted a few familiar faces with brief nods and took her seat at the plaintiff's table. Her legal team was composed of skilled professionals, but Pam herself would be arguing today's motions. She had prepared meticulously for weeks, cross-referencing evidence, anticipating counter-arguments, and studying every nuance of the case law. Judge Chen entered 5 minutes later through the side door in his black robe. The bailiff called the courtroom to order, and Chen took his seat, glancing at the packed room with a faint smirk, as if basking in the moment. "Good morning, counsel," he said, voice calm but carrying that sharp undertone. "Let's proceed." From the start, there was something off in the judge's tone whenever Pam spoke. Subtle interruptions, dismissive comments, eye rolls. Each time Pam stood to present a point, Chen would lean back in his chair, fold his arms, and interrupt with loaded questions or curt remarks. "Ms. Bondi," he said early on, after Pam had barely begun outlining a key piece of evidence, "I would advise you to spare us the theatrics. This isn't a political campaign rally. It's my courtroom." A low murmur rippled through the gallery. Pam remained composed, simply replying, "Of course, Your Honor. I'm here to present the facts." But Chen wasn't finished. Over the next hour, he repeatedly cut her off, questioned her qualifications in front of the gallery, and even dismissed key pieces of her evidence as speculative at best, despite clear corroboration from federal investigators. At one point, during a heated back-and-forth over a damning email chain implicating Avalon Dynamics executives, Judge Chen leaned forward with a sneer. "Frankly, Ms. Bondi, it's no surprise you're making this argument. I suppose in your previous political career, you had the luxury of making grand statements without legal consequence. But this is federal court, not a Fox News segment." The courtroom gasped. Even the defense attorneys seemed stunned by the personal attack. Pam's jaw tightened slightly, but she didn't retaliate. Instead, she stood with impeccable poise and replied evenly, "Your Honor, I would remind the court that I'm here today as legal counsel, representing clients with credible and substantial evidence of criminal misconduct. My political background has no bearing on the merits of this case." Judge Chen smirked again. "That remains to be seen." The atmosphere grew heavier with each passing moment. The tension was palpable, as even members of the press exchanged uneasy glances. But behind the scenes, something else was brewing. Something that even Judge Chen hadn't anticipated. Unbeknownst to him, while Chen had been making his dismissive quips and public insults, a parallel investigation into judicial corruption had been quietly underway. One that involved not only the parties in this case, but the judge himself. Several months prior, a sealed DOJ inquiry had begun into allegations that certain federal judges had been unduly influenced by corporate interests in exchange for favorable rulings. The probe had been meticulously kept under wraps. What few people knew was that evidence had recently surfaced linking Judge Edward Chen to an undisclosed financial relationship with a consulting firm closely tied to Avalon Dynamics, the very company now on trial. This morning, just minutes before the hearing began, federal agents had secured new warrants based on additional wire transfers traced to accounts in Chen's name. And agents from the Department of Justice's Public Integrity Section were en route to the courthouse at that very moment. Back in the courtroom, Pam Bondi continued her argument with unwavering resolve, even as Chen sought to undermine her at every turn. But then, something subtle shifted. A side door quietly opened near the rear of the courtroom. Two plainclothes agents stepped inside, followed by the U.S. Marshal assigned to the building. They exchanged brief glances and positioned themselves along the side walls, unnoticed by most in the gallery, but visible to those paying close attention. Pam noticed. Her eyes flicked momentarily to the agents, then back to her notes. She continued speaking calmly. "Your Honor, if I may proceed with the next exhibit." Judge Chen waved his hand impatiently. "Frankly, Ms. Bondi, I think we've heard enough grandstanding from you this morning. It's becoming tiresome." He stood, adjusting his robe as if to call for a recess, when suddenly, "Your Honor," a firm voice interrupted. One of the plainclothes agents stepped forward, badge visible. "Special Agent McAllister, Department of Justice. I'm afraid we need to speak with you immediately. Please step down from the bench." The entire courtroom froze. For a heartbeat, it was as though time had stopped. Judge Chen blinked, caught off guard. "What is the meaning of this? I'm presiding over a federal hearing." Agent McAllister didn't flinch. "We are executing a federal warrant, Your Honor. You are under investigation for judicial corruption, bribery, and obstruction of justice." Gasps erupted across the room. The reporters surged to their feet, cameras snapping wildly. Pam Bondi remained still, watching with quiet focus. Judge Chen's face went pale. "This is outrageous. I demand to speak with my counsel." But the agents were already moving forward, the marshal stepping in to assist. In an instant, the arrogant judge who had spent the morning belittling Pam Bondi in front of a packed courtroom now found himself at the center of a stunning reversal. As Agent McAllister produced the handcuffs, the gallery buzzed with disbelief. "You have no right. This is a violation," Chen protested, voice rising in panic. "You have the right to remain silent, Your Honor," McAllister said coolly. "And I suggest you exercise that right now." The agents escorted him from the bench as cameras captured every second. And just like that, the man who had sought to diminish Pam Bondi in public was being led out of his own courtroom, in handcuffs. But the story wasn't over yet. In fact, it was only beginning. The courtroom buzzed in a stunned, electric silence for several long moments after Judge Edward Chen was led away in handcuffs. It was as if no one could quite believe what they had just witnessed. Moments before, the judge had been sitting high upon the bench, sneering down at Pam Bondi and dismissing her arguments as though the outcome of this hearing were already predetermined. Now, he was gone, escorted by federal agents before a packed gallery of witnesses, journalists, attorneys, and stunned onlookers. The symbolic reversal was too profound to ignore. A man who had held the power of the gavel was now stripped of authority, reduced to a defendant in his own right. Pam Bondi remained standing at the plaintiff's table. Her heart pounded, though her expression betrayed no hint of personal triumph. For her, this was never about theatrics or personal victory. It was about justice, and justice had just begun to assert itself in a most unexpected way. Across the aisle, defense attorneys whispered urgently amongst themselves. Their lead counsel, a polished and calculating man named Victor Mallard, seemed momentarily paralyzed, as though his mental chessboard had just been overturned. He turned to his associates, his face pale, gesturing for them to check their phones and contact Avalon Dynamics' legal team. Whatever game they thought they were playing was now spiraling beyond their control. The reporters in the gallery sprang into action. Smartphones were held aloft, cameras flashed, and news alerts began racing across social media platforms in real time. Within minutes, headlines like "Federal Judge Arrested During High-Profile Fraud Trial" and "Shock at San Francisco Federal Court. Judge Chen in Handcuffs" began trending nationally. Satellite news vans outside the courthouse scrambled to reposition their cameras, and field reporters hurriedly drafted their live updates. Pam finally took a breath and exchanged a glance with her co-counsel, veteran litigator Samuel Pierce. Samuel leaned in and whispered, "In all my years, Pam, I've never seen anything like this." Pam nodded solemnly. "Neither have I, Sam, but we need to stay sharp. This isn't over. If anything, it just got bigger." The bailiff, still stunned himself, approached the bench cautiously and addressed the courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, given the recent development, this hearing is temporarily recessed. Court administration will issue further instructions shortly." As people began gathering their belongings in a hushed daze, Pam Bondi didn't move to leave just yet. Her instincts told her there would be more fallout, opportunities and risks alike, and she needed to be ready. Sure enough, within minutes, an official from the clerk of court's office entered and approached Pam and Samuel discreetly. "Ms. Bondi," the official said quietly, "U.S. Attorney's Office requests to meet with you privately. They're assembling in Judge Harper's chambers down the hall." Pam straightened. "Understood. We'll head there now." She gathered her notes, signaled to her team, and they moved through the side corridor toward the meeting. Behind them, the once confident attorneys from Avalon Dynamics' defense scrambled to regroup, aware now that their presumed advantage had evaporated. In Judge Harper's chambers, a stately room lined with shelves of federal casebooks, Pam entered to find several key figures already assembled. At the center of the room stood U.S. Attorney Karen Blake, an incisive and respected federal prosecutor whose reputation for dismantling corruption cases was legendary. Beside her were Special Agent McAllister and two senior DOJ officials from Washington, who had flown in secretly overnight once the warrant for Chen's arrest was approved. Karen greeted Pam with a firm handshake. "Ms. Bondi, impressive poise in the courtroom today." Pam responded with a nod. "Thank you. It was an unexpected turn." Karen gestured to the group. "I'm going to be blunt. The arrest of Judge Chen is just the tip of the iceberg. We've been tracking this bribery network for months. The evidence against him is substantial. But so is the evidence implicating Avalon Dynamics and their network of enablers. What's more," Karen continued, "we've just intercepted communications suggesting that Avalon's executives were counting on Chen to quash your evidence on procedural grounds. They thought this trial would be a formality." Samuel exhaled. "Well, they were wrong about that." Karen smiled grimly. "Indeed. But now the stakes have escalated. With Chen exposed, Avalon's leadership is likely to panic, and desperate people do desperate things. We believe they may attempt to obstruct justice, intimidate witnesses, or even destroy evidence. Pam met Karen's gaze evenly. Then we act fast. I have more whistleblower statements ready to file. And there are additional exhibits I've been holding back, just in case the court was compromised. Looks like that instinct was correct. Karen's eyes narrowed approvingly. Excellent. If you're willing, we'd like to coordinate closely. This trial may now trigger a broader federal case. Public integrity, racketeering, conspiracy. This could become one of the largest corruption prosecutions in years. Pam didn't hesitate. You have my full cooperation. My clients came forward at great personal risk. They deserve the truth to come out. All of it. As the team began laying out next steps, word from the outside world filtered in. News of Judge Chen's arrest was spreading like wildfire. Major networks were dispatching anchors to San Francisco. Legal analysts debated the implications on live TV. Public opinion was already turning sharply against Avalon Dynamics, and lawmakers in Washington were demanding investigations into judicial ethics and corporate influence. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, a large crowd had gathered: journalists, activists, concerned citizens. A chant began to rise. No one is above the law. The atmosphere was charged with outrage, but also with a palpable sense of hope. Hope that for once, justice might actually prevail against entrenched power. Back in Judge Harper's courtroom later that afternoon, an emergency session was convened. A new judge was assigned to oversee the case. Judge Teresa Lin, known for her unshakable impartiality and integrity. The court reconvened under heightened security, with U.S. Marshals visibly present in the gallery. When the session resumed, Pam Bondi was the first to speak. She stood before Judge Lin with steady resolve, her voice carrying clearly. Your Honor, in light of today's developments and in the interest of transparency and justice, the plaintiffs respectfully submit additional evidence into the record. Evidence that further documents the scope of Avalon Dynamics' misconduct and the attempted subversion of this court. She handed over the new exhibits, including encrypted communications, financial records, and whistleblower depositions. Evidence that would have likely been suppressed had Chen remained on the bench. Judge Lin reviewed the materials gravely. Thank you, Ms. Bondi. The court will ensure that these proceedings continue with full integrity and that all parties are held accountable under the law. The gallery erupted in quiet applause before being called to order. In that moment, the tone of the entire trial shifted. No longer was it a courtroom manipulated by arrogance and corruption. It was now a battleground for truth, and Pam Bondi stood at the forefront. Yet even as the proceedings advanced, new questions loomed. How deep did the bribery network go? Who else within the judiciary or political establishment had been compromised? And what would Avalon Dynamics' next move be in the face of their unraveling scheme? The answers would soon emerge, but they would not come easily. As Pam prepared for the next phase of this unprecedented legal battle, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. The fight for justice had only just begun. As dawn broke over San Francisco the next morning, the city was still abuzz from the seismic events at the federal courthouse. Headlines dominated every major news outlet. Federal judge arrested in courtroom corruption scandal. Pam Bondi's stunning courtroom victory sets off wave of investigations. Avalon Dynamics on the brink amid bribery allegations. Talk radio hosts debated the legal ramifications. Pundits on cable news speculated about who else might be implicated. And online forums lit up with conversations about systemic corruption in both corporate America and the judiciary. Overnight, the hashtag Justice for All began trending globally, with millions of Americans expressing outrage and hope in equal measure. But while the public digested the news, behind closed doors, Pam Bondi and her legal team were already moving swiftly. The revelations that had surfaced with Judge Chen's arrest had blown the case wide open. And now a much larger fight was underway. At first light, Pam met again with U.S. Attorney Karen Blake and DOJ officials at a secure federal building downtown. The mood was intense but focused. More evidence had come to light overnight: emails, bank records, and internal memos, linking Avalon Dynamics to a broader conspiracy. Karen wasted no time getting to the point. We have evidence that multiple Avalon executives were aware of the payments made to Judge Chen. It goes higher than we initially thought. Board members, outside lobbyists, even political figures. Pam nodded. I suspected as much. The question is, how do we expose it fast enough to stay ahead of any cover-up attempts? Karen exchanged glances with the lead agent. That's why we've called this meeting. We believe Avalon's leadership is already moving to destroy sensitive documents. We have a sealed order ready to execute search warrants at their headquarters. But we'll need your help. Your whistleblowers can guide us to where the evidence is hidden. Pam leaned forward, unwavering. You'll have everything you need. We can't let them bury this. Meanwhile, in the upper floors of Avalon Dynamics' gleaming corporate tower in the heart of Silicon Valley, panic had set in. CEO Martin Greer, a ruthless executive with decades of experience navigating scandals, now faced the fight of his life. He paced in the executive boardroom while his legal counsel and PR team scrambled around him. The televised image of Judge Chen being led away in handcuffs had sent shockwaves through Avalon's leadership. Contracts were being pulled, investors were calling for answers, and federal subpoenas were now a looming threat. This can't be happening, Greer hissed. We had everything in place. Chen was supposed to bury that evidence. How the hell did Bondi pull this off? His chief legal officer, nervously reviewing documents, replied, It's worse than we thought. The DOJ is building a racketeering case. And Bondi's got the public on her side. The whistleblower's statements match our internal comms. They have us dead to rights. Greer slammed his fist on the table. Then we fight. Bury the sensitive files. Get the shredders running. And start a counteroffensive. Discredit Bondi. Attack the DOJ. Flood the media with doubt. We cannot lose this company. But as they plotted their next moves, federal agents were already en route, armed with warrants and guided by the very whistleblowers Greer had once dismissed as insignificant. Back at the courthouse, under Judge Teresa Lin's impartial leadership, the trial resumed with unprecedented public attention. The courtroom was packed with spectators, and news cameras now lined the steps outside around the clock. Pam Bondi entered the courtroom to a quiet wave of admiration from the public gallery. Though she remained as professional as ever, there was no denying that her moral authority had grown immensely since the previous day's shocking events. Judge Lin called the court to order. In light of the recent arrest of Judge Chen and emerging evidence of systemic misconduct, this court is committed to ensuring that justice is served transparently and without delay. Pam stood and addressed the court with her signature clarity. Your Honor, we submit today additional corroborating evidence from whistleblowers detailing Avalon Dynamics' internal strategy to subvert this trial. These communications explicitly discuss payments to Judge Chen and plans to discredit witnesses and obstruct justice. The gallery murmured as new exhibits were entered into the record. The defense team looked increasingly rattled, several members glancing nervously at their phones, likely aware that federal raids were now underway at their client's headquarters. Pam continued, We also have testimony indicating that key documents are being actively destroyed as we speak. We urge the court to issue immediate preservation orders and contempt warnings against any parties attempting to impede this investigation. Judge Lin nodded gravely. This court will authorize those orders. Furthermore, I am formally requesting the presence of DOJ oversight for all proceedings going forward. As the courtroom buzzed, Pam felt a quiet resolve settle over her. The forces of corruption had underestimated the tenacity of those seeking justice. And now, the tide was turning. At Avalon Dynamics headquarters that afternoon, chaos reigned. Federal agents swept through office floors, seizing hard drives, email servers, and encrypted archives. Senior executives were placed under detainment for questioning. Greer's carefully cultivated empire was crumbling by the hour. Meanwhile, the news networks kept pace. Live shots from Avalon's headquarters dominated broadcasts, while legal analysts on every major channel dissected the gravity of the unfolding scandal. One CNN anchor summarized it succinctly: "This is shaping up to be one of the most consequential corporate corruption cases in decades." With a federal judge arrested mid-trial, whistleblowers coming forward, and the public galvanized, Pam Bondi's legal battle may change the landscape of corporate accountability in America. Back in her temporary office, Pam received word that the DOJ's raids had recovered critical evidence. Proof of offshore accounts, bribery records, and a web of financial transactions implicating not just Avalon Dynamics, but lobbyists and public officials as well. Karen Blake called with the update. "Pam, we have enough to take this to a grand jury. But I want you to know, the blowback will be fierce. Avalon's allies in politics and the media are already gearing up to attack you personally." Pam's voice was steady. "Let them try. The truth is on our side, and we've come too far to back down now." Karen replied with conviction. "Then let's finish this." As the sun set over San Francisco that evening, Pam Bondi stood looking out the window of her office, the city lights sparkling below. She knew the coming days would be a storm, one of legal battles, public scrutiny, and intense pressure. But she also knew this was why she had entered the legal profession in the first place: to fight for justice, to give voice to the silenced, to stand up against power unchecked. And now, with the weight of truth on her side and a nation watching, she was prepared to see this fight through to the end. The story of Judge Chen's arrest was only the first act. The real battle, the battle to expose the full extent of the corruption and bring every guilty party to justice, was only just beginning. The following morning dawned gray and cool over the Bay Area, but the temperature inside the corridors of power was boiling. The events of the last 48 hours had triggered an earthquake not only within the federal courthouse, but also across the highest echelons of government and corporate America. What had begun as a complex but routine fraud case was now an unprecedented scandal shaking the foundations of judicial integrity and corporate influence. Pam Bondi arrived early at the federal building, her phone already buzzing with updates. A federal task force had worked through the night processing evidence from the Avalon Dynamics raids. Reports from agents detailed a staggering trove of incriminating material. Encrypted communications between Avalon executives and multiple public officials, slush funds hidden in offshore accounts, private memos discussing strategies to neutralize legal threats, Pam's legal team included. As she made her way to the DOJ's secure conference room, Pam's resolve only hardened. She knew what was at stake now wasn't just a verdict against a corrupt corporation. The integrity of the legal system itself hung in the balance. Inside the conference room, Karen Blake and her team were already assembled. The room was filled with the hum of analysts parsing through digital files, whiteboards scribbled with connections between Avalon executives, political donors, and other compromised officials. Karen greeted Pam with a quick handshake. "Brace yourself. We've got new intel. It's bigger than we thought." Pam took a seat as Karen activated a large monitor, displaying a flowchart of names and entities. "Our cyber team cracked Avalon's encrypted archives," Karen began. "Not only did they funnel bribes to Judge Chen, but we've now identified payments to several federal procurement officials and members of Congress's oversight committees." Pam leaned forward, scanning the names. Some were well-known figures, senior members of key committees, longtime fixtures in D.C. Karen continued grimly. They were setting up a pay-to-play network to rig government contracts, funnel public funds, and quash investigations. Chen's role was just one part of the machinery. But now that part has been exposed, and the whole system is vulnerable. Pam's voice was steady. We need to move quickly. Once these people realize how much we've uncovered, they'll do everything possible to obstruct us. Karen nodded. Agreed. The AG's office is preparing sealed indictments. We're coordinating with federal marshals to protect the whistleblowers. You and your team included. The backlash is already building. Indeed, even as they spoke, corporate lobbyists and political allies of Avalon Dynamics were unleashing a furious PR blitz. Certain media outlets began running hit pieces against Pam Bondi, dredging up old political controversies, casting doubt on her motives. Paid commentators flooded the airwaves with claims that the charges were politically motivated, a witch hunt against corporate America. But Pam had anticipated this. She met with her media advisor and recorded a brief but powerful public statement. This is not about politics. This is about the rule of law. No corporation, no public official, no judge is above the law. We will pursue the truth wherever it leads, and we will not be intimidated. The statement aired on major networks within hours, galvanizing public support. Thousands of citizens organized marches and rallies, demanding full accountability for Avalon Dynamics and its enablers. The hashtag #JusticeForAll swelled to millions of posts, drawing support from across the political spectrum. Meanwhile, back in court, the trial moved forward under Judge Teresa Lin's unflinching guidance. The courtroom remained packed, the air thick with anticipation. Federal marshals maintained a visible presence to ensure security. Pam's team presented the next phase of their case. Witness testimony from whistleblowers who had come forward at enormous personal risk. One by one, the witnesses took the stand. Former Avalon Dynamics engineers, financial analysts, procurement officers. They described a company culture of coercion and secrecy, where dissent was punished and illegal practices were standard operating procedure. They detailed how executives had funneled bribes, falsified records, and manipulated government contracts, all with the understanding that friendly judges like Edward Chen would shield them from consequences. The testimony was devastating. The defense team struggled to mount effective cross-examinations, their confidence visibly eroded. Pam handled each witness examination with grace and precision, drawing out the truth with skillful questioning. The public gallery watched in rapt attention, aware they were witnessing history in the making. But outside the courtroom, new dangers loomed. Late that afternoon, Karen Blake summoned Pam to an emergency meeting. "We've received credible threats," Karen said bluntly. "Avalon's remaining leadership is desperate. They've hired private security contractors, some with questionable records. We believe they may target key witnesses, even attempt to intimidate you personally." Pam's jaw set. "Let them try. But we'll take precautions." Federal agents moved quickly, placing Pam and her team under protective detail. The courthouse security was doubled. Key witnesses were relocated to safe houses. Still, Pam knew the danger was real. That evening, as she returned to her secured hotel suite, she found an anonymous note slid under the door. "Back off or pay the price." She showed the note to her security detail without hesitation. "File it, and tell them this. Pam Bondi doesn't back down." The next morning, undeterred, she was back in court, stronger than ever. Meanwhile, the DOJ's investigation was accelerating. Indictments were being prepared for multiple Avalon Dynamics executives, corrupt procurement officials, and yes, several sitting members of Congress. The scope of the case now rivaled the most infamous corporate scandals in American history. Public momentum surged. Polls showed overwhelming bipartisan support for full prosecution. Citizens flooded their representatives' offices with calls demanding justice. Former allies of Avalon Dynamics scrambled to distance themselves, deleting old tweets, issuing vague statements of concern. And amid it all, Pam Bondi remained at the center, unflinching, undeterred. During a pivotal hearing that week, she addressed the court. This case is no longer about one corrupt corporation or one compromised judge. It is about the integrity of our justice system. It is about whether the powerful can be held accountable under the law. And I stand here today to say, they can, and they will. The gallery erupted in applause. Judge Lin called for order, but could not conceal a faint smile. Justice was gaining momentum, yet even as victory seemed within reach, Pam knew the most dangerous phase was yet to come. Avalon Dynamics had not exhausted its resources, or its allies in high places. The fight was far from over. As the court recessed that afternoon, Karen Blake approached Pam. "We've uncovered something else," Karen said quietly. "A hidden network of shell companies linked to Avalon. The money trail goes deeper than we thought, into places we didn't expect." Pam met her gaze. "Then we follow it, all the way to the top." And so, as the sun set once again over San Francisco, the battle continued, not just for justice in one courtroom, but for the very soul of the legal system itself. Pam Bondi, undaunted, prepared for the next chapter. The forces of corruption had thrown down their gauntlet, but she would not yield. The following days unfolded in a blur of fast-moving developments that transformed the trial from a local courtroom drama into a full-blown national crisis. What had begun with Judge Edward Chen's dramatic arrest was now metastasizing into a sweeping investigation with implications reaching deep into Washington, D.C., Wall Street, and Silicon Valley. Pam Bondi barely had time to sleep as each new revelation sent shockwaves through the legal and political landscape. The protective detail assigned to her by the U.S. Marshals Service remained on constant alert, an acknowledgement of just how high the stakes had become. Death threats poured in anonymously. Smear campaigns online grew more vicious by the hour. Yet Pam remained undeterred. If anything, the onslaught only steeled her resolve. She had faced political attacks before, but this was different. This was the fight of her career, the fight of her life, and she knew she wasn't fighting alone anymore. Across the country, ordinary Americans were rising in support of the cause. Vigils were held on courthouse steps. Citizen groups organized letter-writing campaigns to Congress. Former prosecutors and judges issued public statements praising Pam's integrity and urging full accountability for those implicated in the scandal. The scope of that scandal, meanwhile, was expanding faster than anyone had imagined. In a confidential briefing with Karen Blake and top DOJ officials, Pam was shown a newly compiled dossier from the financial forensics team. It laid bare a stunning web of corruption, over $300 million in laundered funds tied to Avalon Dynamics shell companies, direct payments to at least 4 federal judges, with Judge Chen merely the first exposed, and a constellation of PACs and front organizations laundering bribes to influential members of Congress. Karen didn't sugarcoat it. "We are now looking at a criminal conspiracy of unprecedented scope. RICO charges are on the table. This could bring down a significant chunk of Avalon's leadership and possibly trigger a wave of resignations in D.C. Pam absorbed the information calmly. "And the evidence is solid?" Karen nodded. "Rock solid. We have transaction records, email trails, cooperating witnesses. The challenge now is timing. If we move too slowly, they'll mobilize politically to stall us. If we move too fast, we risk tipping off high-level targets." Pam considered for a moment. "Then we strike a balance, move methodically, but decisively, and keep the public informed. Transparency will be our shield." Even as they plotted the next moves, Pam's legal battle in court pressed forward. Under Judge Teresa Lin's watchful eye, the trial had become a public referendum on accountability. Each day, more whistleblowers testified, more damning exhibits entered the record. Defense counsel for Avalon Dynamics looked increasingly beleaguered, trapped by the sheer weight of evidence and public scrutiny. Then came the week's most explosive moment yet. A subpoena issued from Martin Greer, the CEO of Avalon Dynamics himself. It was a bold move, but one fully justified by the accumulating evidence. Greer had long operated as the untouchable kingpin of the corporate world, a man whose wealth and connections had shielded him from scrutiny for decades. But now, cornered and with his empire crumbling, he could no longer evade accountability. When news broke that Greer would be compelled to testify under oath, the media frenzy reached a new fever pitch. Networks cleared primetime slots for wall-to-wall coverage. News helicopters hovered over Avalon's headquarters. Protesters massed outside the federal courthouse. Inside the DOJ's war room, Karen turned to Pam. "He'll try to stonewall, spin, deflect. But you're the one who knows this case best. You should lead the questioning." Pam didn't hesitate. "I'll be ready." The day of Greer's testimony dawned under a leaden sky, the courthouse swarming with press and public alike. Security was tight, snipers on rooftops, bomb-sniffing dogs patrolling the perimeter. Pam arrived early, composed and laser-focused. As she entered the courtroom, a wave of supportive cheers echoed from the gathered crowd. She gave a brief nod in acknowledgement, but didn't break stride. Inside, Judge Lin convened the session promptly. The air was electric as the courtroom doors opened and Martin Greer himself was escorted in. His once arrogant bearing diminished, though he tried to project defiance. Under oath, Greer began predictably, denials, evasions, claims of ignorance. But Pam's cross-examination was relentless, methodical, devastating. She walked him step by step through financial records, internal memos, encrypted messages. With each document, each line of questioning, Greer's facade cracked further. At one point, visibly rattled, he snapped, "You think you can bring down an entire corporation with this circus? You're naive, Ms. Bondi." Pam's reply was calm, her voice ringing through the courtroom. "This isn't about bringing down a corporation, Mr. Greer. It's about upholding the rule of law, and no one, not even you, is above it." The gallery erupted in applause before Judge Lin called for order. By the end of the session, Greer's testimony had done more damage to his own cause than any outside attack could have. Headlines blazed across the nation. Avalon CO crumbles under Bondi's grilling. Corporate kingpin cornered in court. Yet even amid these victories, Pam remained vigilant. That evening, Karen summoned her for another urgent update. "We've intercepted chatter," Karen reported. "Avalon's remaining operatives are planning a coordinated push, both legal and political. They're lobbying high-ranking officials to shut this down, to smear you, to stall the DOJ. And they have powerful allies willing to help." Pam absorbed the warning without flinching. "Then we press harder. We shine every light we have on this. If they want to fight in the open, we'll meet them head-on." Karen's eyes narrowed with resolve. "And you won't be fighting alone. The public is with us, and so is the full force of federal law." Indeed, as the scandal deepened, the tide of public support only grew stronger. Polls showed overwhelming demand for prosecutions and reform. Congressional hearings were already being planned. Citizens flooded Washington with calls for action. Pam returned to her team that night with a clear message. "We've come too far to turn back now. They'll throw everything they have at us. But we will stand, we will fight, and we will win, not just for our clients, but for the principle that justice belongs to everyone, not just the powerful." The room erupted in applause. Seasoned attorneys, young clerks, hardened investigators, all inspired by her unwavering leadership. But even as victory seemed to draw nearer, Pam knew the battle was far from won. The forces arrayed against her were vast, well-funded, and desperate. The next phase of the fight would be the fiercest yet, one where legal skill, public resolve, and personal courage would all be tested to the limit. And Pam Bondi was ready. The days that followed Martin Greer's disastrous testimony brought an intensification of both triumph and danger. Though Greer's failed performance on the witness stand had turned the tide of public opinion even further against Avalon Dynamics, it had also provoked the full, panicked fury of those who had the most to lose. Now, the battle was no longer contained to the courtroom alone. It was being waged in the highest corridors of power, across cable news, and deep within the machinery of Washington, D.C. Pam Bondi had known it would come to this. The deeper the investigation pierced into Avalon's web of influence, the more desperate and aggressive its allies would become. And they were no longer hiding in the shadows. Almost overnight, a coordinated blitz emerged across multiple fronts. Major corporate media outlets began running stories attempting to discredit the DOJ investigation. Editorials decried politicized prosecutions and warned of judicial overreach. Anonymous op-eds, clearly ghostwritten by Avalon's crisis teams, questioned Pam's ethics, painting her as a partisan opportunist rather than a principled attorney. In Washington, lobbyists with ties to Avalon moved rapidly behind the scenes. A block of powerful senators and representatives, some of whose names had appeared in the sealed indictments, began pushing resolutions to review and restrain the DOJ's public integrity section. They claimed that unchecked prosecutors were threatening the independence of the judiciary and corporate free enterprise. Pam and her team monitored it all closely. Inside the DOJ's war room, Karen Blake outlined the threat. They're trying to create political cover for the guilty. If they can sway enough of Congress or poison public opinion, they'll move to force us into a narrow settlement or kill the broader RICO case entirely. Pam remained calm, her eyes steely. Then we stay ahead of them. Keep the investigation transparent. Keep the public informed. If we let the facts speak louder than their spin, they'll lose ground. At the same time, the legal battle itself escalated dramatically. Defense attorneys for Avalon filed an emergency motion to dismiss the case, citing extraordinary prosecutorial bias and prejudicial media coverage. The motion was a thinly veiled attempt to derail the proceedings before the avalanche of evidence could fully bury their clients. In a tense pre-motion hearing, the defense team launched personal attacks against Pam, accusing her of leveraging political theatrics to influence the court. Pam rose calmly to respond. Her voice was clear, unshaken. "Your Honor, the defense seeks to deflect attention from their client's criminal conduct by attacking the integrity of this court and this process. But the evidence speaks for itself. The facts remain unchanged, and no amount of rhetoric will shield the guilty from accountability." Judge Lin, resolute as ever, ruled decisively. Motion denied. This court will proceed in the pursuit of justice. Cheers broke out in the public gallery once again. But Pam knew this was just the beginning of a broader fight. The political counteroffensive was growing bolder by the hour. Later that evening, as Pam reviewed case strategy in her secure office, an encrypted message from Karen arrived. New intel. A group of Avalon's political allies planning private meeting tomorrow night. Location secured. We'll have eyes on it. Pam immediately understood the stakes. If key members of Congress were plotting to sabotage the investigation or coordinate obstruction, it had to be exposed. She messaged back, "Keep me updated. We'll be ready." That readiness proved critical. The following night, federal agents documented a private dinner at a luxury Georgetown townhouse attended by Avalon's chief lobbyists, 3 sitting senators, and several senior congressional aides, all of whom were now potential targets in the widening conspiracy probe. Surveillance confirmed discussions about pressuring DOJ leadership, discrediting Bondi, and neutralizing key witnesses. Armed with this explosive intel, Pam met again with Karen. "We take this straight to the AG," Pam insisted. "If they're moving to obstruct justice, we need protective orders, and we need it public. Expose them before they can act." The Attorney General agreed. Within 48 hours, the DOJ held an extraordinary press conference. Standing before a sea of cameras, Karen Blake laid it out plainly. "We have credible evidence that certain individuals are attempting to obstruct an ongoing federal investigation into corporate corruption and judicial misconduct. Let me be clear, such obstruction will not be tolerated. The Department of Justice remains committed to pursuing the truth, without fear or favor." Pam stood at Karen's side, her presence a powerful symbol of unwavering resolve. The public response was swift and fierce. Protests erupted across major cities, demanding that Congress back off and let justice proceed. Multiple advocacy groups filed ethics complaints against the implicated senators. News anchors reported breathlessly on the widening scandal. And yet, even as momentum surged in her favor, Pam knew the next phase would be the most dangerous yet. Private intelligence confirmed that Avalon's crisis team had authorized massive dark money expenditures to fund disinformation campaigns and potential, off-the-record, efforts to intimidate DOJ officials and witnesses. One evening, while reviewing documents late in her hotel suite, Pam's security detail intercepted a suspicious package addressed to her. Inside was a crude threat, another attempt to shake her resolve. She didn't blink. After reporting the threat, Pam addressed her team. "This only confirms we're hitting the heart of their power. They're desperate, and that means we're winning. But we have to stay vigilant. Every moment, every step." Even as the personal risks mounted, Pam returned to court each morning with the same calm focus. Each day of testimony peeled back more layers of the conspiracy. And then another bombshell. One of Avalon's senior executives agreed to flip, entering witness protection and providing a sworn deposition implicating Martin Greer, multiple board members, and a sitting U.S. senator in the bribery scheme. Karen briefed Pam immediately. "This is it, the final piece. If the deposition holds up under cross, we'll have everything we need for the grand jury." Pam nodded firmly. "Then let's bring the truth into the light, no matter who it takes down." And so, with the nation watching, the battle entered its decisive phase. The forces of corruption had played their last cards. Now it was time for justice to deal the final hand. The days leading up to the grand jury hearing unfolded like the final movements of an epic symphony. Each beat more intense, every moment steeped in consequence. The lines had been drawn. On one side stood Pam Bondi, the DOJ, and a growing army of citizens demanding justice. On the other stood Avalon Dynamics' crumbling leadership, their political allies, and a shadowy network of operatives desperate to preserve their power at any cost. Inside the federal courthouse, the atmosphere was electric. News crews camped out 24/7. Crowds of citizens gathered daily, many holding handmade signs. "No one is above the law. Stand with Bondi. Justice for all." Pam had barely slept. Each night brought new reports, more evidence, new threats, more political maneuvering. Yet with every challenge, her resolve only deepened. The executive who had agreed to flip, Nathan Voss, Avalon's former chief financial officer, had provided a deposition so damning it could shatter the entire conspiracy. But the risks were enormous. If Voss were intimidated, recanted, or disappeared, the case could collapse. Karen Blake was blunt during their strategy session. "He's under federal protection now, but Avalon has deep pockets and dangerous friends. They will stop at nothing." Pam nodded. "Then we move quickly. We get him before the grand jury and lock in his testimony." At the same time, new fronts of the battle were opening in Washington. In a desperate last-ditch effort, Avalon's political allies had introduced a resolution calling for an emergency review of the DOJ investigation. The thinly veiled attempt to derail the prosecution had drawn sharp condemnation from the public, and even some members of Congress who refused to be complicit. Yet the resolution was moving to the floor, and Pam knew that if it passed, it could muddy the legal waters enough to stall or complicate the indictments. That night, Pam received a call from a longtime ally, Senator James Wexler, one of the few uncorrupted voices left in the Capitol. "Pam, they're pulling out every trick," Wexler warned. "We can block this, but it's going to take testimony. The Judiciary Committee wants to hear from you directly. On the record, you're the only one who can lay out the full scope and stop this political sham." Pam didn't hesitate. "Tell them I'll testify. I'll face them head on." And so it was set. Even as the grand jury prepared to hear final evidence, Pam would travel to Washington to testify before a televised congressional hearing, a showdown that would determine whether the prosecution would be allowed to proceed unimpeded. The next morning, with her security team in tow, Pam flew to D.C. The city was a hornet's nest of intrigue. Protesters filled the National Mall. News choppers hovered over the Capitol. The hearing was already being billed as the most consequential congressional session in years. As she entered the packed hearing room, the stakes couldn't have been higher. One side of the dais was stacked with senators aligned with Avalon, ready to smear, distort, and derail. The other side, led by Wexler, stood firm for justice. The nation watched live. Pam took her seat, swore her oath, and began her testimony. With calm precision, she laid out the facts, the financial trails, the bribery schemes, the judicial corruption, the political collusion, the threats to witnesses, the clear and present danger to the rule of law. When hostile senators tried to interrupt or browbeat her, Pam met them with unflinching resolve. At one point, a particularly aggressive senator sneered, "Ms. Bondi, isn't it true you have political motives in pursuing this case?" Pam leaned forward, her voice steady and strong. "My only motive is justice. I took an oath to uphold the law. The question before this committee is whether you intend to do the same." The room erupted in cheers. Millions watching at home saw the truth. Pam was the incorruptible face of this battle, and her courage was unshakable. By the end of the hearing, public opinion had swung even harder in her favor. Calls flooded congressional offices, demanding that the resolution be voted down. Under overwhelming pressure, swing votes shifted. The measure failed. The prosecution would proceed. Pam flew back to San Francisco that night to a hero's welcome. Yet there was no time to celebrate. The grand jury session was imminent, and the final pieces were falling into place. Inside the secure federal chambers, Pam presented the full scope of evidence alongside Karen Blake. Nathan Voss gave chilling, airtight testimony, detailing the conspiracy in full. Names, dates, transactions, criminal intent. The jurors listened intently, visibly shaken by the depth of corruption. As the session adjourned, Karen turned to Pam. "It's done. They'll vote within the hour." Pam exhaled slowly. Years of preparation, months of battle, days of relentless intensity, all coming down to this moment. When the grand jury's decision came in, the news spread like wildfire. Federal grand jury indicts Avalon CEO, board members, and sitting U.S. Senator on RICO and corruption charges. The indictment sent shockwaves across the nation. Stock markets trembled. Corporate boardrooms panicked. The political establishment reeled. But for millions of Americans, it was a moment of catharsis, a long overdue reckoning. Outside the courthouse that night, a crowd of thousands gathered under the stars, chanting Pam's name, singing patriotic songs, celebrating the triumph of truth over power. Yet even as the victory unfolded, Pam knew the battle was not yet over. The indicted would fight with every resource remaining. Appeals, political maneuvers, media campaigns. All would be thrown at her and the DOJ in the weeks ahead. But now the tide was irreversible. The nation had seen the truth. The law had prevailed. And Pam Bondi stood at the very heart of a movement that had restored faith in American justice. As she looked out over the jubilant crowd that night, her voice rang clear. This is only the beginning. The work of justice is never finished. But tonight, we have shown that no one is above the law. And we will not rest until every guilty party is held to account. The cheers echoed into the night as the final phase of this epic battle approached. A trial of historic consequence that would either cement this victory or test it to its limits. Pam was ready. The nation was watching. The fight for justice would continue. The dawn of the trial's opening day arrived like a thunderclap across the nation. In every major city, in small towns, in homes and offices, millions of Americans turned on their screens to witness history. For the first time in modern memory, a sitting U.S. Senator, a Fortune 100 CEO, and an array of corporate executives were going to face open court on sweeping RICO charges. Charges that had been born out of a single fraud case that had, with the arrest of Judge Edward Chen, exposed an entire ecosystem of corruption. At the heart of this moment stood Pam Bondi, tireless, steadfast, driven by a purpose far greater than personal ambition. Her battle had already inspired millions. Now, with the eyes of the world fixed on her, she would lead the most consequential prosecution of her life. Inside the towering federal courthouse in San Francisco, security was tighter than ever. U.S. Marshals and DOJ tactical teams had locked down the building. Journalists from every major network had descended en masse. The plaza outside overflowed with demonstrators, both supporters and scattered operatives still loyal to Avalon's decaying empire. Pam arrived early, accompanied by Karen Blake and her legal team. She was calm, focused, and utterly prepared. Every piece of evidence had been scrutinized, every witness prepped, every line of argument sharpened to a blade's edge. Judge Teresa Lynn, whose sterling impartiality had earned the public's trust, would preside. Her entrance into the courtroom was greeted with a respectful hush. As court was called to order, the accused entered under the watch of armed guards. Martin Greer, stoic but visibly diminished, two senior Avalon board members, and Senator Mark Clayton, whose indictment had sent shockwaves through the Capitol. Their high-priced legal team sat tensely beside them, ready to wage the battle of their careers, but clearly aware that the tides had turned against them. Pam rose for the prosecution's opening statement. The moment was electric. Cameras captured her every movement. The gallery leaned forward in breathless anticipation. She began, her voice clear and resolute. Your Honor, members of the jury, today, you will hear the story of how greed, arrogance, and unchecked power sought to corrupt the very institutions meant to protect the American people. You will see how Avalon Dynamics, with the complicity of public officials, conspired to subvert justice, defraud the government, and silence those who dared to speak the truth. But you will also see that justice can prevail, that no matter how powerful the corrupt may seem, they are not untouchable. Today, we begin the process of holding them to account. A wave of applause rippled through the gallery before Judge Lynn called for decorum. From that moment on, Pam orchestrated the case with surgical precision. One by one, her team presented evidence so overwhelming it left the defense visibly shaken. Detailed financial records of bribes paid through offshore accounts. Wiretapped conversations between Avalon executives plotting with public officials. Testimony from whistleblowers, now protected heroes, recounting the internal directives to buy judicial outcomes. Video depositions showing Judge Chen accepting illicit payments. Images that chilled even seasoned attorneys. When Nathan Voss took the stand, the courtroom was packed to capacity. Under Pam's steady questioning, He described the entire conspiracy from within. We were told this was how things worked, that we were above the law, that no judge or politician could touch us, because they were part of it. Pam Bondi proved them wrong. The jury sat riveted. Even members of the press, hardened by years of courtroom reporting, knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. The defense scrambled to counter, attempting to sow doubt about witness credibility or question procedural details. But their arguments rang hollow. The facts were too damning, the public too informed. As the trial progressed, the political backlash escalated. Avalon's remaining allies launched a barrage of media attacks. Fabricated scandals, false narratives, character assassinations, all aimed at Pam personally. But each smear attempt backfired. The American people had seen her integrity firsthand. Every attack only galvanized her support. In one iconic moment, during a brief recess, Pam emerged to address the crowd gathered outside. They can spread all the lies they want. They can spend billions trying to twist the truth. But the evidence speaks louder than money, and this courtroom speaks louder than corruption. We will finish this fight. The cheers were deafening. Inside, the trial neared its climax. In closing arguments, Pam rose once more, her words searing into the moment. This case is not about politics. It is not about personalities. It is about whether the rule of law means what it says. That no person, no corporation, no politician is above it. The evidence you have seen leaves no doubt. The time has come to deliver justice. Not just for the whistleblowers, not just for this courtroom, but for every American who believes in the promise of equal justice under the law. The jury retired. The nation held its breath. For 3 tense days, the jurors deliberated in seclusion. Outside, crowds kept vigil day and night. Hashtags like #BondiForJustice and #NoOneAboveTheLaw dominated social media. When the verdict was finally announced, it came like a thunderclap across the world. Guilty, on all counts, Martin Greer. Guilty of racketeering, fraud, bribery, and conspiracy. Senator Clayton. Guilty of conspiracy and obstruction of justice. Avalon board members. Guilty of conspiracy and racketeering. The courtroom erupted. Pam remained composed but deeply moved. Justice had prevailed, not just in law, but in the hearts of the people. Outside, the crowd of thousands roared. American flags waved. Chanting filled the air. "Thank you, Pam. Thank you, DOJ." Karen Blake embraced her colleague. "You did it," she whispered. Pam shook her head gently. "We did it. All of us." Yet even in triumph, Pam understood. This was not an ending, but a beginning. The fight for justice would continue. In every courtroom, every boardroom, every government chamber where power sought to evade accountability. But for now, in this moment, the American people had been reminded of a truth too often forgotten. The law belonged to all, not just the powerful. And one woman's courage had made that truth undeniable. The echoes of that historic verdict reverberated far beyond the marble walls of the San Francisco federal courthouse. In the days that followed, the United States found itself in a moment of rare national unity. Citizens of every background, political affiliation, and community recognizing that something truly extraordinary had taken place. Justice had not only been served, it had prevailed against forces once thought invincible. Pam Bondi's name was on the lips of millions. News anchors hailed her as the woman who had stared down corruption and refused to blink. Editorials across the political spectrum praised her integrity, courage, and unrelenting pursuit of truth. On social media, hashtags like #BondiLegacy and #JusticeReclaim trended for weeks. Public figures, from civil rights leaders to military veterans to grassroots organizers, issued statements of gratitude. But amid the public celebration, Pam remained grounded. She knew better than anyone that a guilty verdict, however historic, was not the final chapter. Real change, lasting change, required more than courtroom victories. It required systemic reform, and it required vigilance. At the DOJ headquarters, Karen Blake convened a strategy summit with Pam and senior federal officials. The agenda was clear: how to turn this victory into a catalyst for nationwide reform. Karen began, her tone determined. "We've broken open one conspiracy, but we know this wasn't an isolated case. Avalon was part of a wider culture of corruption. If we stop now, others will simply adapt. We need to institutionalize what we've learned, create lasting barriers against this kind of rot." Pam spoke with equal resolve. "We need mandatory transparency in judicial finances, stronger safeguards on campaign contributions, whistleblower protections with real teeth. And we need bipartisan legislative action to root out influence peddling at every level." Over the next weeks, Pam worked tirelessly, not as a prosecutor, but as a national advocate for reform. She testified before Congress again, this time to a bipartisan committee drafting new ethics legislation. She met with state attorneys general to help replicate the DOJ's new anti-corruption protocols across all jurisdictions. Her efforts bore fruit. Within months, sweeping reform bills were introduced and passed with overwhelming public support. The Judicial Transparency and Integrity Act, mandating full financial disclosures for all federal judges and prohibiting undisclosed private engagements. The Corporate Accountability and Oversight Act, tightening restrictions on corporate lobbying and political contributions. The Whistleblower Protection Enhancement Act, offering robust legal and financial safeguards to those who exposed wrongdoing. For the first time in decades, the balance of power began to shift back toward the people. Meanwhile, the consequences for those convicted were severe and unequivocal. Martin Greer was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison. His assets were seized, and restitution was ordered to compensate defrauded parties. Senator Mark Clayton resigned in disgrace and faced a separate ethics probe and additional charges. His conviction sent a chilling message to any public official tempted to conspire against the rule of law. Other Avalon executives and enablers faced sentences ranging from 10 to 25 years. The company itself was dismantled, its assets liquidated, and its leadership permanently barred from corporate governance. Judge Edward Chen, whose arrogance had sparked this entire chain of events, accepted a plea deal that included a lengthy prison term, public apology, and permanent disbarment. His name would be remembered in infamy as the judge who thought himself above the very law he had sworn to uphold. But perhaps the most profound change was cultural. Across the country, law schools revised curricula to include case studies of the Avalon scandal. Judicial conferences incorporated ethics training inspired by Pam's work. Civil society groups launched new watchdog initiatives to monitor government and corporate conduct. In every corner of American life, a renewed vigilance had taken hold, and at the center of it all stood Pam Bondi, who had never sought fame, but whose name had become synonymous with justice itself. In the months after the trial, countless honors were offered. Awards from legal associations, honorary degrees, even suggestions of future political office. Pam accepted only those that allowed her to further the cause of reform. In an interview with 60 Minutes, she summed it up simply: "This was never about me. It was about the principle that no one, no judge, no CEO, no senator, is above the law. If we forget that, we lose the very heart of our democracy. But if we remember it, if we defend it, we can make this country stronger for everyone." The interview drew tens of millions of viewers and was hailed as a defining moment of civic leadership. Yet for all the acclaim, Pam remained focused on her mission. She returned to Florida to resume her legal work, continuing to mentor young attorneys and advise ongoing reform efforts nationwide. One afternoon, As she reviewed case files in her modest office, her lead investigator brought in a letter. "From a high school student," he said with a smile. Pam opened it and read, "Dear Ms. Bondi, I watched what you did. You made me believe again that the law can be fair. I want to be a lawyer because of you. Thank you for showing us that one person really can make a difference." Pam smiled softly, her heart full. This, more than any award or headline, was why she had fought, why she would keep fighting, because justice was not a destination. It was a path, one that had to be walked every day, by those willing to stand firm, speak truth, and never, ever back down. And thanks to her, an entire generation was ready to take up that fight. The seasons changed, but the impact of the Avalon trial did not fade. Months turned to a year, and the ripples of what Pam Bondi had helped ignite continued to spread across the nation. It wasn't just that the guilty had been punished, or that reforms had been signed into law. It was that millions of Americans had awakened to the idea that justice was not some distant, abstract ideal. It was something worth fighting for, every day, and something they could fight for, inspired by the courage of those who had led the way. Pam's name remained a fixture in the national consciousness, not in the hollow way that celebrities' names are etched into headlines, but in the deeper, quieter way that true leaders leave their mark on a people's spirit. When polls asked Americans to name public figures they trusted most, Pam Bondi consistently ranked near the top, above many elected officials, above media personalities, above corporate titans. She had proven herself not with slogans or grand promises, but with action, sacrifice, and an unyielding moral compass. But to Pam herself, life was far from some elevated pedestal. She had returned to her private legal practice, now flooded with young attorneys and law students eager to learn from her example. She gave lectures on legal ethics, advised advocacy groups, and remained a behind-the-scenes force for continued reform. Occasionally, she would still receive standing ovations when entering a room, or be stopped on the street by grateful citizens. Each time, she would thank them graciously, but always redirect the attention. "Don't thank me," she would say. "Just promise me you'll stand up when you see injustice." That's how we keep moving forward. In quieter moments, Pam sometimes reflected on how it had all begun. That single hearing before Judge Edward Chen, where arrogance and corruption had tried to humiliate her in open court. She remembered the sneers, the dismissive comments, the courtroom that had seemed stacked against her. And she remembered the moment when federal agents had entered, when justice had taken its first courageous step into the light. That moment had changed everything, not just for her career, but for the nation's understanding of what justice required. In speeches to new law graduates, she would sometimes tell the story, not to glorify herself, but to teach a lesson. The fight for justice is never comfortable. It will test you. It will demand everything you have. You will be tempted to compromise, to back down, to believe the lie that the powerful are untouchable. But they are not. I have seen it firsthand. If you stand firm, if you refuse to be intimidated, if you place truth above fear, justice can prevail. Not always easily, not always quickly, but inevitably. Her words resonated. Enrollment in law and public ethics programs surged. Judicial oversight committees were reformed nationwide. Whistleblower protection organizations expanded exponentially. A new generation of lawyers, prosecutors, and judges entered their professions with the Avalon case seared into their consciousness as a North Star. And yet, Pam never allowed herself to grow complacent. She knew all too well that corruption was a resilient foe. It adapted. It resurfaced in new forms with new faces. The battle for justice would never truly end. And so she remained vigilant. Late one evening, alone in her office, Pam sat with a cup of tea, reviewing reports on emerging cases in other states. Small signs of new corruption networks being quietly exposed by brave whistleblowers. She smiled softly to herself. The fight would continue, and she would be ready. Her phone buzzed. A message from Karen Blake, now promoted to a senior leadership role at the DOJ. Thinking of you tonight. The reforms are holding strong. And we've got new young stars inspired by your example. You started something big, Pam. Just wanted you to know. Pam typed back. We started it, and we'll keep it going. One case, one truth, one act of courage at a time. Outside her window, the lights of the city glimmered. A city forever changed by the courage of one woman who had refused to bow to arrogance or fear. Somewhere in that city, in homes and classrooms and offices, young Americans were learning that truth. Some would become lawyers, some judges, some journalists, some activists. And when the next great test of justice arose, and it surely would, they would remember the woman who had shown them the way. Pam Bondi had proven that even in the face of overwhelming power, justice could triumph. And because of her, the fight for a more just America would go on, stronger than ever.